Now we're going to move on to the profile page and building that out. But as a prerequisite to doing so, we're going to need to set up the followers and following tables to be able to show the number of followers, that is the number of users that are following the current user, as well as the number of users that we're following. The current user has pressed the follow button for. So we're going to first need to set up a couple of tables, following and followers here. And in terms of their shape, they're going to have very similar columns to that of likes. They're going to consist of an ID, which is going to be the primary key, which will generate as always. And it's going to have a user ID of type UUID. And this is going to represent usually the current user. And the profile ID, which is the other user's profile that, for example, we want to follow or unfollow. So each of these tables are going to relate to users. So we're going to need to set up a relationship between them and users. So we'll first want to go to users and set up an array relationship. We'll configure a new relationship because of course we want every user to have multiple users that they're following or multiple users that are followers. So we'll set up first an array relationship for followers. That'll reference that table. And it's going to be from ID to the user ID. And the very same for following. Type array, name, following, reference that table from ID to user ID. And next we'll go to both followers and following. We'll go to following first and set up an inverse relationship, an object relationship for user, reference the table users, and it's going to be from the profile ID to the ID. And then for followers, object, user, reference the table users from profile ID to ID. Now that should get us what we want. Let's just test this by querying for a user, and we should be able to get the people that they're following. Let's say we just want to get their ID for now, and followers and following try to get their ID, and of course we don't have anything just yet. But if we look into both of them, we'll see that if we go on to either field, we can get the individual user information for followers or following. So again, this is going to be necessary for creating the query to get all of our profile data. So let's do that. Let's make a new query, and we're going to call this get user profile. Let's write this in graphical. Now we're going to need to query for the user according to their username. So for this query, we're going to add a new one. We're going to find the user where the username is equal to the variable, and we're going to have it return the following: the ID of the user, their name, their username, website, bio. We don't need their email, but we will need their post aggregate, and then aggregate and count within that. To get the number of posts that they've made, we're going to need their followers and following count. So we're going to need followers aggregate, aggregate count, as well as following aggregate, aggregate count. Then after that, we'll need their posts. That's what we're going to display underneath, as well as their saved posts. We're only going to display the saved posts if it's us, if it's the currently authenticated user looking at his own profile. So we'll grab posts, and we want to just display some grid posts here that are really just going to consist of the media. We'll get the media from each post, as well as the ID, then the number of likes and comments that each have. So again, on that, we'll use likes aggregate count, and then comments aggregate count. So that should be our entire query. We'll pass in some, I'll call this get user profile, and create a username variable. It's going to be a string and required. We'll pass that to our EQ operator, and we'll add just some username that we know exists. So we'll copy all this and paste it in. Let's go to our profile page, and we want to grab the username from the parameters. So I believe if we go back to our routes, I called that username. So we can do the use params. Yeah, that's the use params hook from React Router DOM. And with that, we're going to get back an object. And within it, we'll get username. Then we can execute our query, and we'll grab get user profile, pass through our variables. So we'll make a variables object with username, and we'll get back data and loading. And if we're loading, we want to return the loading screen, which we'll import. And here for isOwner, we can finally calculate that. If we're the owner, we're going to, first of all, note that our user data is going to come from data users and then the first element, and that's what we're going to set to user. We could also do destructuring here. You could destructure the first array element like that to get user. We want to take the user's ID and see if it's equal to the current user ID. So we're going to need to grab that from user context. We'll import that and grab current user ID. Only if those two values are equal will it be, will we be looking at our own profile. And next we need to pass down, instead of the default current user, we want to pass down the actual user data. So to each of these user props here on profile name section, we'll set user prop to user, and we'll replace default current user anywhere that we see it here. So we can just, I believe we can do a replace all. I'm going to replace everything with just user. And I'll save just to make sure that this works. So can't read length of undefined at grid posts. Yeah, this is one problem with using the grid post. Since we're using an aggregate here, I'll just console log the post data that we're getting. If we take a look at that, we're not getting comments like before. Again, we're getting an aggregate, so we can't take the length of that comments property. So we have, if we look at that, we get the ID comments aggregate instead of the comments property. So again, what we can do is we can create a couple of variables. We can take the comments aggregate and put it in a variable called comments count. We can take comments aggregate from post, so post.comments aggregate dot count, and replace that where we previously had comments post.comments.length. That'll be comments count. And we can do the same for likes. Likes count. It's going to be post.likes aggregate.aggregate.count, and change out post.likes with that. So that should hopefully fix the issue. And it looks like I'm still trying to get the length somewhere of something. The length we're trying to get in the profile page. Let's go back to profile. We're trying to get the length of these different user options. So remember that the options that we had here were post, followers, and following. Well, we're trying to get, user, and then select that option .length. Since we're getting the count from an aggregate now, instead of having an array of posts, an array of followers, and an array of following, we need to take the option and interpolate the text aggregate. And we need to, instead of saying length, we need to say .aggregate.count. And I believe that should fix our issue there with getting the count of each one of those for posts, followers, and following. And it does. Okay, so we have 1 post, 0 followers, 0 following. And we see the correct number of likes and comments there for our 1 post. Good. Now we do need to pass down the profile picture. It looks like that's not being passed down correctly. So we need to look for profile picture, and instead of just passing down is owner here, we also need to include the image prop and provide user.profileImage. And let me check the other one. We want to pass down image to that too, user.profileImage. Now, I'm still not seeing it, so I believe, did I include that? Did I include profile image? I might not have. No, I didn't include profile image in the query, so we'll go back to queries and just add that manually. Okay, good. Now we can see it. But since we're the owner, we want the ability to actually change this. As I mentioned, just like in Edit Profile, when we hit Change Profile Photo, a dialog came up and we could choose a new pic. Let's do the same here. To do that, we're going to need to go into the Profile Picture component and take care of that. And I believe we can get rid of the default image. We don't need that. So what we'll do is, for the wrapper, if we have an image, we want users to be able to click on it, and if they're the owner, we want to open a file input. So again, we're going to create a function to do that. Otherwise, we're just going to provide a function here that's going to return null. We want a kind of no operation. So let's make a function open file input, and we saw the approach to doing that. Again, we're going to need to create a ref, use a ref, which we'll call input ref, and make a new input above that will hide by setting display to none. We want to set the ref to input ref. We want this to have a type of file, and when the file input, for the file input to open, we want to say input ref.current.click. And for the on change, when it's selected, we'll call a function handle update profile pic. And we can take that function from the edit profile page. Remember that function handle update profile pic. We can just copy all of that and use that right in here. We will need to use a mutation. So we'll import that function. I'll do so manually. I'll use mutation up at the top, and we'll need to also import the handle image upload function. It just doesn't want to work. Okay. Use mutation from Apollo React hooks, then handle image upload, that function, which it looks like I'll have to manually import as well. Handle image upload from, and that was in the utils folder, so we'll go 2 levels up, 2 levels out, utils handle image upload, and we'll also need the edit user avatar constant. So we'll use mutation, pass edit user avatar in, get back our edit user avatar function, and we're not going to set the profile image here. What we can do is we can set a new piece of state that we'll call image use state, and we'll have it accept the default image from props, and then we're going to call this image img and then set image. So we're going to set the image at the end when it's updated, and the image source at the bottom is going to be just img. So I believe this should work. Let's save everything. And user is not defined. Line 16, yeah, we need the ID, so we can grab the current user ID again from user context. Okay. So let's try uploading a different picture. So we see the file dialog open, select another picture, and we see it immediately change. So perfect, we can change our profile picture here too. And we see that it's, it syncs with what we see in the nav bar too. Now I haven't checked the saved tab, but let's go back and try saving a post. Let's go to a valid post. It might require again, oh wait, we can just select the one that's in our profile page. Select the one that's in our profile page, and it looks like we're getting another error. Can't read property post by PK if undefined. And I believe the issue here is because for the post modal, we're using the post ID for the params, but I changed the name of the prop earlier from ID to post ID. So if you've had problems opening a post, that's the reason why, because of the name change for props. And can't read property aggregate of undefined. Let's try going back to our profile again. I'm going to try going back to my profile again, not to my individual post, and selecting it and see if that fixes the problem, and it does. That's good. Now I'm just going to save this, add a saved post, and then look at my saved tab and make sure that I see that as well. And I don't see anything in my saved tab just yet. And the reason for that is we're not passing any saved posts down within our profile page. So let's head down, and we see if we go to profile tabs, that individual component, if we look at the saved post component that we created, yeah, nothing is being passed down there. So we're going to need to pass the user data, user prop down there too. We're just going to need that one prop, and we'll destructure that. And previously we just had this no content. What we're going to do now is we're going to wrap this in a condition. So if user.saved_posts.length is 0, then we're going to return all of this. But otherwise, we're going to return exactly what is returned in the profile post component above. So we can copy what it returns at the very bottom, paste that underneath, and here all we have to do is just say user.savedposts.map and map over each grid post. Now we should be able to see all the posts that a given user is saved in their profile page if we're that current user. Now it doesn't look like we're passing through saved posts, and that might be another thing I forgot to include in the get user profile query. Yep, we also need to include saved posts. And saved posts is a little bit different. Let's just take a look at our previous query. For saved posts, we can't just, immediately get all of the posts on it. We need to, if we take a look at its field, if we take a look at our schema, if we select saved posts, we're going to need to select the post field within it, and then choose all of the same fields as we did for just regular posts. So we can copy everything in the posts field right here, and add that to the post field within saved posts, like that. Save post, and then all the same fields as we had underneath right here. So that should resolve our issue, and we should see the one saved post. But we're getting an error, it looks like, for aggregate of undefined. So I know the mistake. For iterating over all of the posts here in profile tabs, we're going to need to also destructure the post here, the post field here in the parameters, and that's going to resolve our issue because of that whole issue of having that nested post field within saved posts. So now we should be able to see our saved posts, and we do. Good. And let me just edit my profile just to make sure that we can see the website field and the bio field. Good. Okay. Now what is the next step going to be? Well, when we look at another user's profile, we naturally want to be able to follow them. So if we go to a different user's profile, another valid user, we're going to see following, even though we haven't configured the mutations to actually be able to follow someone or unfollow someone. And additionally, we also want to give, if we're following another user, we want to give that user that we're following a notification of that. So let's see how we're going to write that mutation for following a user. So I'm going to clear everything out, and this might not make too much sense at first, but if you think critically about it, it will in just a sec. We're going to make a mutation called follow user, and there's going to be two variables here. One is the user ID to follow, the ID of the user that we're following. So say we're following this user, user 10. User ID to follow, that's their ID. And then our ID, the current user ID, that's what we'll name this variable, is ours. And for this, we're first going to insert followers. And for objects, we want to set the user ID to the user ID to follow. And then for the profile ID, we want to set that to the current user ID. And we'll return affected rows. Then we'll insert following, which will just be the inverse. So for objects, we'll set the user ID to our current ID. And then for the profile ID, set that to the user ID to follow. And return affected rows. And then finally, we're going to insert notifications. For objects, we'll set the user ID to the current user ID, and the profile ID, the person who's going to be notified of it, is the user ID to follow. And the type here is going to be the hard-coded string value follow. And again, we'll return affected rows. So making sure our mutation looks exactly like that, and what we can do here, we can test this. We can test this by searching for the user's ID and username. And so we can select the user that we're currently logged in with and have them follow the user whose profile we're looking at. So we can make that query and provide in the query variables area first the user ID to follow. Let's say the ID for user 10. And the current user ID, which is our ID. And we'll run that mutation. And we want to make sure that this works, and mine currently doesn't. And the reason for this is because for notifications, we want to make it possible. We want to modify our notifications and make it possible to sometimes pass null for the post ID. We don't have a post ID here, so we want to make nullable true some of the time, specifically for these follow mutations, for these times when we're following another user. So let's run this again, and we see that this works. Good. And if we return to our user that we're looking at, their profile now says that they have one follower, which is us, and if we look at ours, we see that we're following one user. Good. So let's take that mutation and put it in a variable for within the mutations file. We'll call this follow user, and then we'll make unfollow user. So this is going to require some small changes. Let's rewrite this from scratch. It's going to look pretty familiar though. Write a mutation unfollow user, and we can keep the same variables as before. Here we're going to have delete followers. We're going to delete it where the user ID is equal to the user ID to follow, and then where the profile ID is equal to the current user ID, and we'll return affected rows. Now we can copy this, and for delete following, we want to do it where the user ID is the opposite. Current user ID, and the profile ID is the user ID to follow. And finally, we want to delete notifications where the user ID is equal to the current user ID. The profile ID is equal to the user ID to follow, and where the type is equal to the text follow. And again, return affected rows. So if we run this, it should remove the follow that we just made, the follow mutation, and we should see 0 following for us, and for that other user, 0 followers. And once we know that that works, we'll make an unfollow user variable with that mutation. And of course, we can check and make sure that in data there are no notifications with the type of follow, and there aren't. It's going to be necessary to use these two mutations in a number of different components throughout our application. So it's going to be necessary to get information about, for example, the IDs for the users that are following us, the current user, and the users that we're following. So we're going to want to, within app, add a few more values to pass on our user context object. We'll add one called following IDs, the IDs of all the users that we're following, and that's going to come from our Me subscription. So we will need to add a few more fields to this to grab all of the users that we're following and our followers. So let's grab followers and grab the ID and user ID fields, as well as following and the same fields for both of them, subfields. So let's head back to app, and we can simply say me.following.map. And actually I wrote this incorrectly. As I mentioned before, we have a relationship between following and users and followers and users, and because of that we're going to run into that nested field situation where instead of us getting immediately, as I wrote just now in subscriptions, instead of just getting the ID and user ID immediately off of followers as a direct field of it, we actually need to get it off the user field that it has a relationship with. So the followers for the current user, on the followers field, the user data for each of the followers is going to include ID and user ID. And most important for us is going to be the ID for each of them. So back in app, we're going to map over me.following, and we're going to destructure the parameters to get the ID from each of the users. The way that we're going to do that is we'll first destructure the user property and then map over it to get user.id. And we can do the same for the followers, or we're going to call this follower IDs. It's going to be from me.followers, and we're going to do the same operation and then put them both on this context object. Following IDs and follower IDs. So why does that matter? Why do these matter? Well, for example, if we're looking at another user's profile, we're going to need to see if that user actually is in our following array, if that user's ID for whom we're looking at is in our following array, to see if to figure out what operation we want to perform. If we're already following them, we want to then unfollow them. If we're not following them, we want to perform the follow user mutation. We want to follow them. So now we can head back to our profile page after saving this and saving subscriptions. We can head back to our profile page, and we can go to the profile name section component. And here is where we're going to perform the appropriate mutation, either follow or unfollow. But first we're going to need to read from user context. So we'll grab user context, and we're going to grab the current user ID, following IDs, and follower IDs. And this is going to allow us to replace these two hard-coded values for isFollowing and isFollower. We're going to make some dedicated state values for each of these. IsFollowing, they'll have a setter of setFollowing, and then isFollower and setFollower. And their initial values are going to be set according to the value of two different variables, isAlreadyFollowing. And actually for the second one, we don't have to make that a state variable. What we'll first do is iterate over the following IDs and see if there's some ID that is equal to the user ID. That is, if we're already following that user. We'll provide that as the initial value of isFollowing. Now if that's the case, we're going to show the follow button here. And if we click on this, we're going to show the unfollow dialog. So we're going to go down there and set up, the mutation to unfollow a user. But let's stick with the logic here. So if we're already following them, isFollowing is going to be set to true. If not, we might have another condition of isFollower. And this person is going to be a follower of us if it's not isFollowing, and if the follower IDs .sum has an ID which is equal to user.id. Now, in this case, if they are a follower of us, it's going to run this condition and it's going to give us a button of follow back. So we can click this button and follow the user back if they're already following us. And in which case, we're not following them, but they are a follower, and that's included in our follower IDs array. So when we click on this button, what do we want to happen? Well, we want to follow them. So we'll add an onClick, and we're going to call a function handleFollowUser. And again, we can create our variables object above, and it's going to have a variable of user ID to follow, which is going to be set to user ID, and another of the current user ID, which we're getting from props. So here we'll make the handleFollowUser function, where we'll set following to true. So we see the following button now. And we're going to call followUser, a new mutation, which we need to call useMutation in order to get. And we'll pass it the followUser variable, which I might need to import myself. FollowUser up at the top. So that's going to come from the queries, or the mutations file, followUser, and I'll just go ahead and grab unfollowUser as well. So back down there, we're going to get our mutate function of the same name, and we're going to call it with the object that variables has. And finally, in the last condition, we also want, when we just see the follow button, when we click, we want to handle follow user as well. Now, let's go into, scroll down and go to the unfollow dialog. We want to take care of unfollowing a user here if this is open and the user selects, unfollow that following user, and well, hits exactly, to be precise, the unfollow button. So let's use mutation here and pass it unfollow user. We get back unfollow user, and let's create a function handle unfollow user. And what do we want to happen? Well, again, we're going to need to collect our variables, so we can read from context the current user ID and put that in the variables object. Then user ID to follow is once again going to come from user.id. And and then we will unfollow the user with the variables, but additionally we want to close this dialog. We want to close this dialog, and also we want to set the value of following in the profile name section to false. So we need to pass down a callback function on unfollow user, and here we'll set unfollow user to false and set following to false. And we don't have to, but for performance's sake, we can, use callback if you want. This is optional. Unfollow, wrap that function in a use callback and call this on unfollow user again, and then go down past this to unfollow dialog at the very bottom, and we'll call this on unfollow user and pass that through props. And we're just going to call this at the very end, on unfollow user. So save everything, and there's no set unfollow user. I meant to say set unfollow dialog. Okay, so perfect. We see this new user. They're in neither of our arrays, following or followers, so we just see a plain follow button. Now when we hit the follow button, we see following. If we refresh, we should still see following. And we do. Good. And if we unfollow, looks like we're getting an error here. Invalid prop on close of type boolean supplied. Looks like for on close, let me scroll down here. On close. Oh, and I also forgot to, I forgot to add to the unfollow button, the on click handle unfollow user. How could I forget that? And then for on close here, we need to supply the prop on close. Let's try that one more time. We're following the user. We hit it again. We see the dialog. There's no error. We hit unfollow. We see the follow button. Now if we refresh, we should still see it. And we do. Good. And if they were to follow us, if another user was to follow us, we would get a notification about it. And when we looked at their profile, we would see a follow back button. But at the moment, it looks like everything's working perfectly, following users and unfollowing them, and presumably notifications of them. Says, since we can see that if we follow another user, if we go to data and look at notifications, we can see another one here, a notification with the type of follow.